This is a brief training video that will show you how you can make use of CodeGen's repository structure field subset feature. Let's get started. I have pre-configured a very simple environment in which I've set up the location of the repository files that I wish to use and set my default template directory and output directory to the current directory. I've also pre-created a very simple CodeGen template called dataclass.tpl. Let's take a look at that file in Workbench, and you'll see that it's a very simple template that is going to create inside a namespace a public class with the name based on the name of the structure. We've used a field loop to declare a backing field for each of the fields within the structure, and we've used a second field loop to declare a public property for each of the fields in the structure that exposes and or sets the value of the associated backing field. A very simple template. Let's go back to our command prompt and show you what happens if we generate code from that template. So let's issue our CodeGen command for the template called data class, and for the repository structure name part. And also we use the namespace token in the template, so we need to specify the name of the namespace we wish to use, and we'll call it data classes. And we'll go ahead and generate the code. Let's add the -lf for list files option so that we can see the name of the file that's generated. And you can see CodeGen generated a file called part.dvl. Let's take a look at that source file. So we'll refresh the view here and go and edit the part class, and you'll see we've got namespace data classes, public class part. We've got a backing field for each of the fields in the repository structure, and then we've got a public property for each of the fields in the repository structure that exposes the appropriate backing field or sets the backing field to a new value. But what if we wanted to produce a class that represented only part of the information of that record? Let's say we wanted to have a method that returned a collection of just the part ID and its associated description, and not all of the properties. Let's say perhaps we're passing that over the wire via a WCF call or something like that. How could we go about creating essentially a class that represents a record via public properties, but only for a subset of the fields in the structure? Well, CodeGen has a mechanism to allow us to do that. So let's close down the source file and return to the template. Actually, we don't need to make any changes in the template whatsoever. What we're going to do is we're going to make a small change in the repository. So let's go back to our command prompt and let's open up the repository, and let's drill down into the structures and into the part structure. We'll look at the list of fields. And what CodeGen allows us to do for several things, but this is just one example of it, the subset features, is it allows us to embed additional information into the repository that can be recognized and used by CodeGen. And generally that information, these special tokens, if you like, can go in one of two places. They can either go in the field's user text, although we quite often find that that's being used for other things within an application, and its length is quite limited as well. So as an alternative, you can put them in the field's long description. Now what we want to do is we want to come up with the way of processing a subset of this structure for just the ID and description fields. And the way CodeGen allows us to do that is if we go to the ID field and into its, I pressed the wrong button. If we edit the field's long description, we can put a special code in here. We can say @sub equals, and let's call it ID description, and then semicolon. So we've said this field is a member of the subset called ID description. Okay, let's copy that so that we can apply it to another field, and we'll go and apply that very same thing to the description field. So again, we'll edit the long description, and we'll put that very same information into the description field's long description in the repository. Let's back out and save our changes. So we'll exit from the structure and save those changes, and then we can close the repository, and let's see what happens. Well, if I just issue the same CodeGen command, there's nothing here that's referring to the subset of fields that I want to process. So I need to do two things. I need to first of all add the -r command line option, because by default CodeGen will not overwrite the existing file part.dbl, but I also need to specify the name of the subset. So I can do that by saying -subset and then the name of the subset that we defined within the repository structure. And what that's going to do is it's going to constrain any repository field loops to now only processing fields that are part of that named subset within the repository. So let's go ahead and execute the code, and you can see that we've got one file created. Again, it was part.dbl, and let's go and take a look at the file, and now you can see our backing variables in our class. We only have backing variables for ID and description, and indeed we only have public properties for ID and description. So we've constrained that field loop based on some artificial criteria that we added in the repository, in this case in the field's long descriptions, using those special codes that CodeGen only recognizes. If you want to get a little bit more information on this feature, you can go to the CodeGen documentation, so CodeGen-docs, and you'll find under preparing your repository there's a little description of field subsets that describes what we just looked at and gives you the example of the syntax that you need to use. Of course, if you aren't using CodeGen on Windows, then you can always refer to the CodeGen online documentation, and you'll find it in exactly the same place, preparing your repository, field subsets, and that documentation can be found at codegen.synergex.com/help.